So we'll just go around and hear from everybody who they are and what hat or hats they've got on and what their interest in participating in DemFest is, or being here today. Maybe I'll begin. My name's Plaxi McCulloch. I'm a member of the Canberra Alliance for Participatory Democracy and of Active Democracy Australia, specifically Active Democracy Bean. And I guess I'm here because the presentations today look really fascinating. And I'm here more generally because of my interest in what I can do and the context that what I can do at a very local level is in at a broader national or intermediate scales, and other ways that I might be able to contribute and encourage others to contribute. And I'll hand over to Gilles, so I can ask you, is it Gilles, which I've been saying for years, or is it Gilles? Or Gilles?
Yeah, you don't pronounce the S usually. It's
okay.
Gilles or Gilles is fine.
Great. Fine. Thank you. Over to you.
So yes, my name's Gilles, as you can see. I'm a member of CAPAD and other community groups. I'm quite involved in the local community, for example, as part of the community council here, involved in a number of things. I've been interested in such matters regarding, I suppose, justice, democracy, the environment in broad terms, among other things. And I'm particularly interested in, I've read a bit of your stuff, Millie, which I find very interesting, and I'm very interested by some of your perspectives, including in your PhD, all give and no take. And I'm very interested to hear what you'll have to say about the public good, or I often like the common good, but it's fine. It's fine. You can say the public good. I'm happy with that.
And hand over to someone else.
Done it again, Robert.
I'm a founding member of the Canberra Alliance, but I'm also very much involved with a group called Council for the Human Future, which has been stimulated by the work of Julian Cribb and is very much engaged as John Hewson and a growing group of people who are concerned that no government anywhere in the world is seriously tackling the threats to human survival that are interacting and that are part of our agenda. I'm desperately concerned about the state of Australian democracy. I don't think it's working at all well at the moment, and we've come across very badly in Paris at this point. And I hope that somehow or other a combination of changes in the way we do democracy in Australia and a serious confrontation of the fact that on present trajectory, my grandchildren haven't got a hope of lasting my age. And I'll pass over to Thor.
Thank you, Robert. I'm here because ever since I was a little kid, I felt that there was something not quite right about the way the government ran. And then I got older and ended up with a day job as a software tester, business analyst, technical writer. And I seem to have some skills in analysing complex systems. So I turned those skills to our system of government and came up with the conclusion that the root of the problem was that there was no separation of powers between the elected representative and the voters. So that could get blended and mixed up. So I've also in parallel developed a collaborative space because I've got a lot of really good ideas. There's a lot of other people who've got a lot of really good ideas, but there's no one of us or one group who've got all the ideas that can fix all the problems or take the opportunities that we've got. So out of that, I'm trialling an experiment, I guess, in political science in Dixon to see if I can prove that this works. And if it does, then I guess I've got some credibility to stand on. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you. My involvement stems from my decade or more involvement in various planning issues around Canberra, and I've been a member of several groups in that respect, including the community councils, in particular the Combined Community Council, to keep them working together. My particular concerns are the way, well, in the planning system, the way consultation is conducted, which leaves most people feeling very unsatisfied with the feeling that they're not really being heard, or if they're being heard, their opinions are not being taken into consideration. Having said that, there have recently been some announcements that indicate that the government has been taking notice of some things, but it's not necessarily obvious at the time or even later. So and as Bob has indicated, there's been a gradual decline in our political system over the last few decades, which we need to try to rectify in some way, especially given the current conditions and the fact that we have some critical life-threatening issues that need to be properly addressed. Okay, I'll hand over to Petra.
Thanks, Robert. Well, I've been a member of CAPAD, the Canberra Alliance, for quite a while now. I guess my interest, I wasn't interested in politics at all as a child, except to listening into my parents having conversations. That didn't happen all that often, but every so often, particularly when they had some of their German friends around, because my parents were German born, there were conversations about the war. So they were German citizens at the time of the Second World War, and my parents' generation were around 14, 15 years old at the time. And there were conversations about how did it come about? How did this war ever happen? And I could sense from my parents' conversations that they were completely stunned that this actually happened in their lifetime. And of course, they were just teenagers. They had no power, no influence whatsoever, but they were incredibly severely affected by the state of the government and the world affairs. So they had a very deep interest in governance themselves. And I guess that kind of just came across to me that it's so important, and that these kinds of fascist governments can kind of creep up without you realising. And when I hear Robin and Bob say, you know, these things our democracy's been whittled away or eroded in quality over the decades, I'm thinking, well, it happens so insidiously, doesn't it? And it could creep up on anybody, as it did in the time of my parents, and how shocked we would all be, even though it's in plain sight. It's right there for us to see right now. So, yeah, I've got deep concerns about that. I'm really keen to work with other people who have deep concerns to finding ways forward that that can prohibit these kinds of things happening, or definitely take us on a curve that improves the situation at the moment. And I'm very much looking forward, Millie, to hearing what you've got to contribute today. I love what Australia Remade has been doing, and yeah, thank you. I'm really looking forward to that. And I hand over to Barbara.
I can hear birds tweeting. Must be nice. Yeah, I spent all my paid working life in the aid and development field, but particularly focusing on the gender dimensions of what we did. And I'm a very active member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest women's peace organisation in the world. We started during the First World War, where we tried to bring about an end to the war. The other thing was, you know, as a member of the women's movement in the 1970s, I was mostly involved in women's electoral lobby. That was an education, I can tell you, going around and interviewing all those politicians. My other current involvement is the Women's Climate Congress, which Millie, you're familiar with. So, I mean, you know, all of this, really, my basic interest is in having, in all people having that all people's voices are heard, and that they all have the opportunity to participate in decision making. So, hence my involvement in CAPAD and the what's going on there. Oh, sorry, and who I hand over to Peter.
Which Peter?
Oh, sorry, Peter Martin.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, as I said yesterday, my background was in science, and during that career, I became increasingly aware of the huge gulf between environmental reality as we were experiencing it and public policy. And so I got increasingly interested in the concept of sustainability and thinking about what a sustainable and desirable future would look like. And I ended up secretary of a little think tank called the Wakefield Futures Group. And through that and through my readings there, I've got interested in become a member of the Saltitian Foundation. And at the moment, a colleague and I in Adelaide are organising a group called SASCA, which is South Australians for Community Assemblies, for citizens' assemblies. And our first meeting of that is coming up at the end of the month. That's a public meeting. So yeah, that's where I've come from. And I'm supposed to hand over to, who's next in this list? I've got to scroll through this list of faces to see who's next to me. I've got Petra next, the other one next to me. Am I at the end, am I?
What about the other Peter?
Oh, yes.
And then we've got Glenn, and then anyone, and Rob's joined us too. Fantastic.
Okay, there's Glenn. Okay, let's hand over to Glenn.
Great. Hi everybody. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late. I'm Glenn Cummings. I'm one of the founders of ProAct, which is a sort of a community-based Voices For group here in the ACT, looking at options of getting an independent senator elected. There's a senator, one of our two senators here, who probably doesn't represent the people particularly well. And so there's some discussions around sort of that Voices For concept. I guess what drove our little group to form about 6 or 8 months ago now is just a lot of sort of resonates what I've heard so far is this lack of voice, just real lack of people being listened to. There's increasing marginalization of different groups of the community, whether it's gender, which has clearly been toxic up on the hill for a long time that Barb talked about earlier, or whether it's just increasing inequality, and this real lack of accountability in government just frustrates me. I guess I wouldn't say I'm a class warrior in any way, shape or form, but I come from a working class background and sort of first in family to go to university and spent sort of 6 years working for NGOs throughout Africa and Asia, and saw some of those what happens when you get autocratic governments and how it just leaves people behind, and how, you know, I mean, that was at the extreme end in some of the poorest places, but the lack of accountability and transparency just really got to me. I don't know which one of the rorts it was earlier in the year, sports, car parks, take your pick. We're hearing about them all, that left me just thumping the kitchen table until my partner said, well, you know, do something. We have to do something, you know. And so we found a Proact, which now has about 300 odd people sort of working towards hopefully supporting an independent candidate who backs science-based policy, you know, who isn't afraid of science and engaging with it, who backs integrity and ethics and the things that I think this group sounds like we're talking about. The only other interesting fact that I have to say is that we recently bought a house in O'Connor, and I keep getting mail for Millie Rooney delivered here. Apparently I'm living in Millie's childhood home now, so lovely to finally meet you, Millie.
Yeah, sorry about the mail. I have been trying.
No, it wasn't a complaint. It was one of those really nice things. We're having a community meeting in our front room, and your name comes up in a lot of our meetings. You know, we need to connect. And I was like, that name's so familiar. And it was after the meeting, I looked on the bench. I went, that's why it's really familiar. I don't know who I'm passing to.
Who you haven't heard from. Rob, would you like to go next?
Oh,
You're
yeah.
on mute, Rob. We're just for those who've just joined, we're just introducing ourselves and what brings us here today.
Okay, I'm Rob Salter. I come from Melbourne. And we're appreciating being out of lockdown now. And I'm retired. I had a career in the community, various jobs in the community sector and in academia in areas like sustainability and politics and sociology. I am here mainly because I came up with an idea last year, which has evolved into an organisation called Active Democracy Australia, with the help of Peter and Mark from CAPAD and Marcus Crowley in Sydney. And we've just launched our new website. And our aim is to encourage groups of people in every electorate, every lower house federal electorate, to form an election action group and to look at a range of options for improving representation. But I won't go into any detail because I'm going to be talking about this at 11 o'clock. So that'll do for me. Good to be here again.
Sue, are you wanting to duck in?
Thanks a lot, Plexi. I shall briefly from the Cape, which is almost done. Yes, my name is Sue Ingram. I'm also a member of CAPAD and part of the BEAM Active Democracy Group, along with Sheila and Plexi. And yeah, my background is working inside public administration in Australia and working in governance internationally. And I suppose for me, it seems almost like humbug telling other countries how to run their affairs when you've got a sense of unease about your own country, and important to try and tackle the issues that are so important to all of us, like accountability and transparency. So that's what brings me along.
Thanks, Sue. Is there anyone that we didn't hear from in this round?
Moi.
Oh, Peter.
Yeah. So great Maori word, whakapapa. My whakapapa is that I've got to being a member of CAPAD and actively supporting Active Democracy Australia because my life journey through Aboriginal health and into public health and then into planetary health has shown me that if we're going to actually have well people in a well society on a well planet, then we need to have good government that's governing for the public good or the public's good. And so that's what has brought me here. And I'm just looking forward to today getting a whole lot more really wonderful ideas about how we can do this better.
Thank you, Peter, and everybody. So I'll formally introduce Millie now. Millie Rooney is the National Coordinator of Australia Remade. We've got a session that will go until 10:30. Millie's going to give us a 10 or 15-minute presentation and then open to questions and discussion. Millie's bio puts first that she is a carer for her family and community. She's passionate about acknowledging this work as a valid, valuable, and legitimate use of her time, which I applaud and thank her for. Millie has a research background with a PhD in local community and social norms around neighbourhood sharing and community building. She was the research coordinator for Australia Remade before being the national coordinator, which gave her the privilege of listening to hundreds of people reflecting on their hopes and dreams for this country. Her previous role was coordinating the national award-winning Sustainability Integration Program for students at the University of Tasmania, which supported and empowered students to create change for a better world through system transformation. Millie has been involved in Australia Remade for several years and writes that she is in awe of the passion and power that emerge when we start collectively dreaming for the world we want. Millie grew up in Canberra, as we know, on Ngunnawal country. Well, no, we didn't know that you grew up here. And now calls Nipaluna, which is Hobart, also known as home. Thanks very much for joining us. Millie, over to you.
Thanks, Plaxi. And it's so nice. I'm feeling a bit emotional because not only is Glenn currently living in my family home, but Robin is also my mother-in-law. So it's very nice. I'm going to out as Robin. It's nice to sort of, be around family and family home. Glenn, you're kind of part of it now. And it's always interesting to hear your own bio read out to you. You're like, oh yeah, that is me. So I'm here on the land of the Muanina people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thinking about what it means to live on country that has a really long history of a different way of governing to the one that I grew up in, a different way of relating to each other, to place, and just holding that thought that we're around this incredible history that is ongoing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So as Plaxi said, I'm the National Coordinator for Australia Remade. I'll introduce that in a moment. I have a background in qualitative research, and when a student I was working with recently said, well, what does that mean? I said, it means I'm a really nosy neighbour. Like, I just love learning about people, and I get to do that as my job. And when I was a kid, I think probably 6, Mum did a lot of activism around the Gulf War and refugees, and we would spend a lot of time standing outside the Woolworths in Dixon collecting toothbrushes for Gulf War refugees. And I remember saying to Mum or someone at one stage, you know what, when I grow up, I'm going to be a butterfly dancer on stilts, and I'm going to get on the front page of the newspaper, and I'm going to be a good news story, so it's not all just about war. And I can walk on stilts, yet to put on the butterfly costume. But I actually think there is still a really important role for that butterfly dancer. And I feel really lucky that my work at Australia Remade lets me do that. And so one of the things I want to bring today is, yesterday I was at another conference on democracy, and it's very intellectual, a lot of these conversations. And I want to present to you some research that is real, legitimate research. But I also want to weave through that the reminder that we have to talk about vision, we have to talk about hope, and we have to talk about love when we do this, because the intellectual stuff is one thing, but like, why are we here? You know, why do I feel emotional? It's because I can see Robin and Glenn, you know, like, this is what connects us. So for all of the other tools we have, remembering that's not just an add-on, that's really essential. So Australia Remade began as an organisation, began as an idea a few years ago when a whole lot of civil society leaders from across different networks, so whether it was refugee advocacy, climate change, First Nations, different groups, came together and said, like, we're losing on everything. We've got a few wins, but overall, this is not going well. And we're very good at saying no. We're very good at saying, not this, stop that, no this, let's deprive ourselves of this. Did you know everything is really terrible and will keep being terrible? And it was around the time Naomi Klein wrote the book, No Is Not Enough. And so the group really took that on and worked with Naomi in some of that space and said, well, what's our shared vision? What's our shared yes? And of course, you can't create a shared yes for the whole country when it's a group of mostly white, mostly middle class CEOs of NGOs. So I had the absolute pleasure of going out and talking to lots and lots of different people across the country. And, you know, I was joking yesterday, we heard a lot of similarities, but some differences. But the differences were things like one group of people told me they like drinking beer from a shoe. One group of people, which is a thing, if you didn't know, it's an Australian thing to drink beer from shoes at parties. I didn't know that. The other group talked about, you know, having a glass of wine with their family. You know, the differences in conversation were about how it is expressed rather than the shared values. And we heard a lot about democracy. So we're now supported by a bunch of different civil society groups, so Greenpeace, Australian Conservation Foundation, the Uniting Church, ACOS, Australian Council of Social Service, and then a lot of others that we work with behind the scenes. And we really, from the work I did listening to people, we created a vision for Australia, which is called Australia Remade. It's got the 9 pillars. Democracy is one of the key pillars there. And so a really big part of our work is trying to help people to maintain and hold on to ambition. Like, let's be ambitious. Let's overshoot our ideas. Let's go big. Let's be bold. Like, it can be hard to do that because you're seen as the naive little person in the corner being like, we could be like this. Well, we won't be if we don't have a go at that. So part of our work is really, how do we hold each other accountable to ambition? We try and be really collaborative. So we do a lot of listening, and the project I'll talk about in a moment is, again, more listening, but also collaborating, working people with people, ideas with people, ideas with ideas, and doing a lot of connecting. And some of that's really public work, and some of that's a bit more behind closed doors. And we try to do this work in a way that's transformative. So rather than just the kind of spot fires, like, what's the shared analysis that's holding back work across all the different fronts? And again, some of that is involving the public, and some of that is just some smaller groups. So that's broadly the background of Australia Remade. Happy to chat more about where we're going next year because we're feeling pretty excited about it. But I wanted to take some time to talk you through the detail around the public good project that we're doing. And I have a few things I just want to say before I keep going. Firstly, this project is not where I thought it would be at this stage. It's running behind for really good reason. COVID has put 50 spanners into 50 wheels and made community engagement really, really hard. Secondly, it's a community project where we're genuinely listening, which means I'm working on community timescales. And I love it, and they drive me up the freaking wall. So there's a real tension between trying to get this work done and having the integrity to do it how we said we'd do it. And also wanting to say that, I don't know about you, but I'm really tired. It's been a massive year. We've just had COP. I've had a not very great personal week. And I wanted to say that stuff because I think when we talk about democracy and we urge for transparency and truth and trust, like, let's start modeling that. I'm going to tell you what's going on a little bit behind the scenes because we're all bringing that, and it doesn't mean that what I'm going to say isn't relevant or useful. It's just not where I thought it would be. And recognizing that we're bringing our whole selves to this, and that's what I hope for democracy. And bring your whole tired selves to this conversation. You know, be kind, but you know, you don't have to be perfect. And really what I want in the discussion is I need your help. I need your help to work out where some of this goes and how to make it most useful to people like you. And if you have any questions as we go, just jump in. So in about, it was 2019, 2020, we saw the big bushfires. I know those of you in Canberra were really seriously impacted. I was there around the New Year time and it was pretty awful. So we had that, and then we had COVID hit. And that moment of disruption was a time when we started, generally, broadly the public, we started to realize the value of public good, whether we use that word or not. You know, people were saying things like, the ABC literally saved my life. Community radio literally told us how to escape. That's how we got the information. public health is, saving us. Privatization, turns out there's some problems with it if you look back at the hotel quarantine privatization. So people are starting to see the value of these services provided and see the role of government, the role of the collective in doing this. At the same time, they were also seeing, don't even know where my thought was going. But, is this moment of disruption where people are starting to question. But yeah, at the same time, we're also seeing the narrative in the news kind of pit the economy against people and against health. And I think that's a really important thing that we just saw happen, because people suddenly realize, hang on, there are values driving the decisions. Like there are active decisions about how this country works. So I think there's a real moment there. And we thought, well, it's time to start talking about what we want broadly as a public good agenda. We've assumed that GDP and the economy push our decisions, but that's wrong. I feel that's wrong. Why don't we let's ask what the new narrative is for that conversation. So we were thinking, well, what does it mean to set a new public good agenda? And I was involved in so many conversations with so many leaders from the progressive movement when COVID hit, saying, let's get a 10-point plan together. Let's put a list of demands together. Let's kind of unite behind something. And it was impossible. No one could do it. So we've been trying to go with a bit of the stealth approach of what if we all start talking about the public good? We don't badge it, we don't have a hashtag, but we just start weaving it into the conversations that we have. And so we've been thinking about public good as the things that we decide collectively as a community are important. We make sure that they're available and accessible where they're needed, regardless of whether they bring anyone a profit. And we've been thinking about it in terms of things like, roads, sewage systems, hospitals, schools, but also connections like time, culture, faith, community, and frameworks like democracy, justice, transparency, etc. They're a bit clunky, those categories, but they help us think, public good, we're not just talking about the school system. And so we took that conversation out to lots of different people and ran a 3-step process where I trained a bunch of facilitators. They run conversations in their community. We come back together, we talk about what they heard, we set the agenda for the next conversation, and it happens 3 times. The dream version of the project didn't happen, but we have had and are continuing to have really great conversations and really great connections across the different groups. So they're not random groups, they're groups that are people who are situated within networks that would benefit from sharing this stuff. And so some of these people have been paid to facilitate, people who couldn't otherwise do so. So some refugee groups, Indigenous groups, and then we've got other groups like Uniting Church has been involved, school kids, academics, young people, queer groups, general public. Happy to go into the detail of the how for anyone who cares later. And it's a process that I totally adore and makes me cry because it is so difficult to do because you're wrangling 50 million people. And for anyone who is running those community projects, like, you understand, it's joyful and you have to let go of a lot of control. And that's been a really valuable just process lesson, is we've had to be willing to fly by the seat of our pants in a bunch of ways because we're responding to what community wants. And I think it's so easy to talk about community consultation and not actually let yourself be shifted by what the community wants. So we aim to build a big new picture agenda around the idea of the public good, and we're starting to see that language go into weird places and useful places as people are using the language of the public good and the ideas. And we wanted to elevate the conversation about what should drive our decision making as a country. And we wanted to connect with and across networks and communities so that we are still doing our individual work, but we're sort of, vaguely in the same orchestra. And I can explain later if we have time what bits of that have been very successful and what bits of that just need more resourcing. But we heard some really interesting things. Firstly, everyone, when you ask people what public good do you want available to you in your community, which was the first question for the groups, it's very clear. There's a list of 6 that just come out. Housing is nearly always number one, and it doesn't matter whether it's a group that has secure housing or not, that one comes up. Jobs, education, healthcare, access to nature, and access to the internet. A lot of this was done during some of the big lockdowns, so access to nature and the internet were very, like, that's really context specific, I think. So that was pretty quick, and all of you could probably list, you know, yes, public good, I want these things. It'd more or less match. But what really shocked me, and I think is probably the most useful lesson for this group, and a really hard one, weirdly, is, and actually something that you all said reflecting on yesterday, the conversation then very quickly turns in every group to be, I want to form community with ease. I want a place where the coffee is free. I want to be able to belong. I want to be able to contribute. I want to be able to have agency both locally and nationally, you know. And I think Queensland Council of Social Service talks about communities where people contribute, matter, and belong. And I can't think actually of a better phrase than that. And I think there's a real opportunity there for us to offer that. And when we then ask, well, who's responsible for this? People are saying things like, oh, well, the government really should, you know, the government needs to. But then very quickly, the government's not up to the task. We've got to work around the government. Part of me cheers really loudly when I hear that, because I think there are heaps of wonderful ways we do work around government and can, and there's a lot of potential. But the other part of me worries about that, because I think we leave a vacuum, one for government and that sphere of power to be taken over by other people and other interests. And two, because there is an interest in business doing that. You know, people are saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if, like in the bush, Rio Tinto came into our suburban community and ran a community festival, and, you know, they owned us and gave us a sense of identity. You know, that's, to me, worrying, right? Because that's money buying community. So why are we collectively, it's a challenge I have, why are we not providing that? And I think part of that is, you know, Rio Tinto can go in and they open the pool. There's no political agenda. They're just having fun. And I think we need to remember to have fun in this work. Like, that's an essential piece of the puzzle. It's not a nice add-on. So I do really worry that if we work around government, we kind of concentrate our wealth. You know, I live in quite a wealthy suburb. We're fine. We've got enough money to build a playground if we need to as a community, or, you know, fireproof our places, or all of those things, but we concentrate our wealth rather than, you know, taxes, for example, which allow us to distribute it. And I think we then get too heavily reliant on, you know, kindness of our neighbours and the mutual aid groups. And I think they're fantastic. I absolutely 100% think they're part of the democratic infrastructure. But that's not an acceptable social safety net, right? We actually need a system, you know, a structural system that supports this. And then very quickly, before I just open it up to you guys, I think the big themes that have come out of this have been, we need a new national story, or stories that say who we are. And that's partly reconciling with our past. You know, that we often have this narrative of like, the past was terrible. You know, look at we're a colonial society. The past was terrible. You're a bad person. The present is bad. And the future, you know what? It's grim. Like, who wants to come to that party? If like that's the party we're offering, that sounds terrible to me. So what is the story that brings us together? And as one participant, she's a migrant woman, said, I want to be able to belong without having to fit in. And I think there's something in that. So a narrative, and then, you know, connection. People really want to connect with each other and with place. So what's the infrastructure for that? I think examples of that are, you know, roads, gathering spaces, park benches, online spaces, communication tools. People really want care and to be cared for. What's the infrastructure for that? That's healthcare, that's emergency care, but that's also clean energy. And contribution, people desperate to contribute. So what's the infrastructure? Democracy, the public service, workers' rights, etc. And so I think, you know, the key things for me, as you all said before, there's a yearning to participate. People might not call it democracy, but they want to be involved and they want to have control. And I think we need to start with that assumption. You know, it's not that people are idiots or just not interested. They just don't know how. I think there's a yearning for people to belong, to contribute, to love and to be loved, you know, to be proud, to love this place, to love our community. And I think we need to fill that space. And I think that's a space we don't take seriously enough. And we need to fill the space in a way that connects with power. And all of the groups you're talking about do that really well, I think. But that reminder, you know, the kindness of strangers, our local communities, they're not an acceptable replacement for a social safety net. And the final thing is a shared language and shared questions are powerful. For me, what I would love to see everyone doing is start talking about the public good. We can debate whether it's public good or common good. I think public good is more helpful because it doesn't have certain political or religious baggage, but I actually don't really care that much. I think we adapt it, and that's the joy of it. But I think if we're always talking about this is the local issue, but how does it progress the bigger picture? And I think universalism is a really important value to bring in there. So the next challenges for me is how we build on this, because there's some really great conversations started there. There's some really great insights that we've gained from the project, and I nearly have it formally written up, and I'll be very happy to share it with you when I do. But I think we need to start thinking about the infrastructure for this stuff. And that includes things like, how do we talk about the infrastructure for care? Biden's been doing some interesting stuff there, but actually valuing the sort of, they're not empty spaces, but the relational spaces as really essential parts of this work. So I'll hand it over to you, and I'd love your responses, how this sits with you, questions that you have, what you think is useful for shifting the bigger conversation about why we do what we do as a country. And yeah, really just keen to hear your responses at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Millie. There's a couple of comments in the chat. I'm not sure if they're questions though, so I'll leave that over to the people who posted. I've got zillions of questions. Perhaps I'll start with one and then let's go for it. You were talking at one point about, this is just random from my list, about having to let go of control in the process of working with community and go with the flow of what community was wanting. Can you give one or two examples of what you're thinking of?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, one, it's just the practical thing of timeline. Like, you know, I'm working with a group of people who are, so they're young people, they have lived experience of homelessness and various struggles. And you know, COVID hit, they've been in Melbourne, so the multiple lockdowns. If I'm genuinely respecting their experience, when they come to me and say, we can't meet this timeline, this deadline, like I can't turn around and say, oh, well, I know you don't have housing security or anything else like that, but we've got a project to run. You know, like part of it is accepting that that's, you know, and I find that really challenging. And then the other thing, so one, it's I think being clear about what your hard boundaries are and how, like I'm constantly adapting participation process. So this group couldn't then participate in the whole timeline of the project. So we had to reinvent something so that their voices were still legitimately heard. And so that meant they used a whole lot of online tools that no one else was using. And so I think it's the process that is the biggest thing, but also I let them set the agenda for the second conversation. And partly that's a fine line between, I just had to take control really, because they all wanted someone to lead that. But they also wanted to go a place I didn't want it to go. And I had to mostly let them and trust that something useful would come out. Because I think and those of you running the deliberative stuff will know this, but reflecting back to people that you've heard what they said and that you're listening, like that's a powerful act of training for democracy. So yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Gilles?
Okay, this may seem at a bit of a tangent, possibly a little bit provocative. It's, I suppose I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate, but I feel it's something we don't necessarily talk about, and I think is quite relevant to what you've been saying, Millie. So basically, to what extent do so-called democratic principles apply in our personal lives or within organisations involving volunteers, for example? Much discussion is technical, theoretical, removed, as you suggested. Is respect necessary, including regarding other people's feelings, including in small-scale communications, even in simple things like responding to or simply ignoring emails or messages? Does it matter what people feel personally? Do we really care about others' emotions beyond trying to use them for our purpose? And I'm not saying this is what we do. I'm playing the devil's advocate here. Like in large-scale politics, and we've got some good examples at the moment, including right now, do the ends always justify the means? Are we too busy and focused to even have to care? What do you think?
Well, I can go first, and if other people want to jump in, but I mean, I think we do have to care about that stuff. Like for me and how we run Australia Remade, and partly because we're small at this, you know, we haven't gone viral or anything. So maybe when we get really famous, you know, this might be different. But like I 100% believe in those small connections and those replying to the email and with a, you know, thanks so much, I can't help you or whatever, you know, like I do believe in that stuff. And it takes time, right? It takes time. But what are we doing if we're not doing that? Like what's the point if we're not kind of living into that world? And I think that I really struggle sometimes with that sense of at what point do I, you know, I get a lot of lonely people who sometimes have mental health problems wanting a place to belong. And I get some pretty wacky interactions. And so my process for that is to be polite, and eventually I don't block them, but I hide them from our social media because I don't think they're contributing, you know, I think they're distracting. But I think that's where the Voices For movement is really great with their be your best self. You know, there's some values that you stick to, and then you apply them to every single bit of the work that you do.
Rob.
Oh, you're on mute. Also, I think Peter, just Plaxi, I think also Peter has his hand up. It's just hidden in the CapAd logo.
Oh, yes.
But,
right.
yeah, go, Rob.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, Millie, I've gone through your website a couple of times and I found it very inspiring. In fact, puts a lump in my throat, really. And I would be really interested in talking to you sometime about, I'm not sure whether you've got any kind of discussion units on the website. I can't remember it, but I'd be really interested if we get our group, well, when we get our groups going, to have some specific discussion sessions that are about Australia Remade. And, you know, there could be some preliminary reading of sections of the website or other material that you would suggest. And then just have people have a series of questions and have people go for it and see where it takes them. So be good to have a discussion with you about that sometime.
Yeah, and that would be great to have a separate chat. And actually one of the things we want to do next year, sort of building off the Public Good Project, because part of what was fascinating to me about that is people came together in those conversation groups from really different places. So the groups I facilitated had people from every state in the country. And the excitement and energy and kind of collegiality of being like, oh, that's a cool thing you're doing in WA, you know, like we should do that. And there's just the sheer power of cheering each other on. I know that's not quite what you're saying, but we've been talking about, well, how do we provide spaces to build that sense of collaboration and excitement? And you know, I see so much of our job is just telling people like, yes, keep going, there's a wonderful world to win. And like, who doesn't need to be told that every day? So I'd love to talk more about that. Yeah.
Good.
Peter, apologies.
Hey, thank you, Millie. That was, as usual, inspiring. And so sort of, it's more a comment. Yesterday, Marcus Crowley presented to us his work around place score. And I would just suggest perhaps looking at his website, because what place score does is it's a tool that collects data for local councils. It's a for-profit organisation because that's the world we live in. But the data that they produce actually gives at the local government level a rich picture of the society. And I was reminded of this when you were talking about, you know, when you do all these discussions with people, all sorts of stuff comes together. And it reminds me that some other stuff I've been reading recently talks about the disconnect between the elite and the people, and how when you ask people what they want and think is important, you get one bundle of stuff. And when you ask the elite what they think is important, you get a different bundle of stuff, and they don't talk to each other. Mm. And so that's another one of these disconnections that that we're living in. And so, I mean, that's just an observation. Mm. And then the challenge for me then as a GP, my gut response to most things is, okay, there's a problem, how do we fix it? And in parenthesis, I realize that's not always the only way. But I think this idea of building the infrastructure. And so in this space that we're talking today, it's about how do we build the infrastructure? Because you talk about, you know, what we decide is the public good and how do we make that happen? Well, that's of course a democratic process.
And I think I've got heaps of things in my brain about that, Peter, but it just reminded me that so I was on a call at another conference yesterday, and a woman called Jolene Elberth from Australian Conservation Foundation was speaking as well. I don't know if you've come across their work on democracy, but they have a really fantastic kind of democracy messaging guide. And one of the things that the lessons from that is, you know, when we talk about setting an agenda, we, all of us, have to be careful not to set a public narrative that says everything about our democracy is broken and crap, because that's really disempowering, and it means people switch off. And what we need to be doing is saying, democracy is a wonderful system when it works properly. Here are some of the things that are not working properly and why, and this is what we do. And I'm not sure that's their exact messaging, but you can have a look. And their reminder is to remember the power that we all have in our networks to set that story, and to remember what we do have. Like, we have some amazing parts of our democracy. You know, we have some, you know, we have the you know, the secret ballot, you have to vote, compulsory voting. We've got a history of of democracy being put to amazing use. We've got things like Medicare. It's not perfect, it's being eroded. But like, if you were in the US right now, your eyes would fall out of your head when you heard about it. So just remembering that we need to push the story of the good bits and what can be as well, I think, yes, not quite exactly responding to what you said, Peter, but it made me think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, the message I got from that ACF work previously was that we can't, it's dangerous to bag government.
Yeah.
Because we need good government to ensure the public good.
Yeah. And
so the way I've been thinking about that in messaging CAPAD users is, you know, the problem is not government. The problem is that the way the MPs in government are behaving. And therefore, this supports our message of, therefore, we need MPs that are going to work for the public good.
Yeah. And then we need the structural changes as well. And obviously, yeah, but it's well worth a look at the guide. Yeah.
Where was that, Millie? Was that ACF?
Yeah, yeah.
It's on the CAPAD website in our resources hub.
Oh, great. Thanks. That sounds really valuable. Petra. Peter, could you unraise your hand if you wouldn't mind?
Okay, thanks, Millie. That's fantastic. I guess something in me, I'm just really fascinated by this example that you gave, if you could call it that, of this juxtaposition, if you like, of being in your local community, talking to certain groups, and this was in the context of social security. You're talking to your homeless young people, and you know, you're saying you needed to. The way I picked it up was you needed to adapt to their situation and really listen into them, to let go of your control of the situation to an extent, you know, the timing and so on, and just trust to flying by the seat of your pants, which is a real skill, a really hard thing to do, to just let it go and flow with it and move with what comes to you from the outside, and to have that sort of mobility and flexibility and responsiveness and all of those wonderful qualities within that situation, and at the same time acknowledging that being that flexible person, being that open and kind person, totally responsive to the other's needs, isn't everything. You still need the overall structure. It's not going to replace, I think these were your words, it's not going to replace a structural system that supports social security. We can do that on the local level. There are certain things we can do on a local level, and we want to build that richness and that relationality between community members at the local level. But there's also, it can't replace a governance structure. And so having good democratic process to create a governance structure that actually supplies social security is just as much part of that picture. Is that what you were saying?
Oh yeah, there's a few things in there. So in terms of the, like working with those groups, there is that fly by the seat of your pants kind of, and that it does take a skill, but you can manage it by, again, the Indi example of really clear values and really clear boundaries, and that idea of, clear is kind. So being really honest about, this is what I can and can't offer in this process. I'll work with you, I'll adapt with you, but actually come the 1st of November, I can't, so all of those things. So I think there is that balance in that small scale between really clear leadership and also not just saying, well, you tell me what you want to do, because that's overwhelming, but also saying, this is my plan, this is how you fit, does this work, how can I tweak it? So I think it's that radical trust and confidence to lead at the same time, which is a balance I'm constantly questioning in myself. And then that thing that you were talking about of like, yes, we can be kind to everyone and we can include them, but until we have that structural change, it's nice and I think essential. Like I also truly believe that stuff is the infrastructure that enables the rest of the revolution. We move at, this is not my quote, but we move at the speed of trust, so we have to build that trust. But I think we can, and the local is where it's fun. My street party, we have so much fun. We set things on fire, we play with the kids, we gossip, we make plans for how we're going to survive the bushfire. Like, that's fun. I like that stuff. So I think that's the heart. That's why we do it. I'm not actually that interested in dry conversations all the time. It's depressing. I'm over it. Like, don't freaking steal my present as well as my future. Thanks. So I think we need that. But how do we do both? So an example in my community is, so we're a pretty wealthy suburb. We worked out that the university down the road has about $40 million in fossil fuel investments. But I worked out that in South Hobart, there's about $400 million of movable assets in like mortgages, insurance, etc. But we could probably move half. So what if we ran a campaign which was like, let's lock the gate on fossil fuel investment in our local area as an identity. Let's say, let's have that identity as South Hobart, and then let's do a deal with a bank or something to say, if we move $200 million, which I reckon is the amount that is movable, if we move that, can you commit to investing up in the Northwest where there's much less money? Can you commit to investing in a community hub or a solar something, or, so how do we locally do something that gives us community and identity and fun and purpose and shares our wealth? So I think it's also thinking about how we sort of stack those things up. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'll just chip in from the chat. There's been a couple of comments from Peter and Glenn about we need to have ways of measuring human well-being, built into our economy. I think there's been a lot of work done over the last decade in wellbeing measures, internationally and nationally, you know, from the Bhutan's happiness index through to Canberra, actually just before COVID closed us all down, was actually doing an active wellbeing, community wellbeing project where they were going to lead that into doing a wellbeing budget, following on Jacinda Ardern's example in New Zealand about having a wellbeing budget. And so looking at what are the metrics, and there's a whole lot of stuff on the ACT government website if you want to go and have a look at that stuff there. So I think this is a real thing. You know, people are actively thinking about well-being. And then, of course, that the next thing is, okay, well, rather than just commenting on that, because I mean, the economic things that are valuable are things like, is everybody housed? Has everybody got enough income to buy food and clothe the kids? And that sort of really useful stuff, rather than what the NASDAQ is doing last night. And the other dream that some of us within the Public Health Association have had for a while is this idea that instead of having that economic money finance report at the end of the news, you actually have a wellbeing report, and that over a period of a year, you could actually cycle lots of different indicators through that for people to look at. And there was actually a radio station in Melbourne, I think, who was doing this a couple of years ago, where they were doing a state of the climate report at the end of the news. It was a commercial radio station. It wasn't particularly widely listened to, but they actually were trying to get it embedded. I haven't had any contact with them for about 3 years, so I don't know where that went. But it's a thing, and it's part of that building the infrastructure and changing the story. So I just make that observation.
Yeah, and I would agree. And there's Andy, the Australian something index, but I would also sort of add a yes and to that, which is, let's not go down the path of metrics too much, because some of the most important things you can't measure. So I've been thinking about, you know, in my community, I'm often the person people will come to when they're having a teary, and, you know, my whole PhD was on this give and take stuff, and I can't start measuring, you know, oh, that's $50 for turning up on my doorstep, you know, or I can't, as soon as we articulate that as a service, it loses its value. So I think also thinking like, one, how do we measure the well-being stuff, but two, how do we make sure that we are driving our decisions by a shared set of values? Like, why do we implement this road? We're doing this because we value X, Y, Z, because, you know, so I think it's both of the bookend and the other end. Yeah.
Just pipe up to note that, believe it or not, we only have 6 minutes left. So Gilles, would you like to go next? And then perhaps if there's still time, we'll just hear from someone that hasn't spoken yet. Thanks, Gilles.
Okay, I'll be very, very brief. And I suppose I'm asking for some practical tips here, because it's something I'm struggling with at the moment in what, well, among other things, what the Bean Group is trying to do, but other things I'm involved in. Do you have any suggestions how we reach beyond one's socio-econo-cultural group? Are there practical approaches we can use in the day-to-day and in the broader democracy reinforcing context, I suppose? I remember a while back, you were considering the term delight. I don't know if you thought about that a bit more, but anyway, might not be the moment. And what you are doing, you've mentioned some of this, doing beyond what you're doing in research. You've mentioned that you're often the go-to person where you live. And door knocking, for example, is used as a technique, and this was talked about yesterday by the Greens, as a way of connecting with people. But I suspect there are other ways that you can do this that perhaps you've come across in your work and in your more personal life, I suppose.
Oh, it's so tricky. Like for us to get real different diversity in the Australia Remade work, that's not necessarily through sort of gatekeeper organisations, and even then, like, we have to pay them. That's the first thing, is like those groups, there's reasons they can't participate, they need the money. So that's not an easy solution, but it's something that we do. I think also the making opportunities easy for people. So thinking about the stuff we've done in our own community. I used to run a pancakes in the park thing for neighborhood day. And basically it was me being like, right, it's neighborhood day. I love community. I'm going to make pancakes on the barbecue in the park and see who turns up. And I got all these people saying, oh, could I bring my belly dancing troupe? And I'd be like, oh, sure. Like, I'm not the boss, but putting myself out there meant that I was the yes person. But it was a public place. There was no rules about entry. So we had a bike fixing session, and we've got a big housing commission community nearby. And we actually got more of them in than usual, because we weren't holding anyone captive in a space. We weren't having a process. You could just sort of oozle onto the edge and be like, oh yeah, I'll have a pancake. Like, I know how a pancake transaction works. I stand in a line, you cook the pancake, you hand it to me. I can scurry off to the other corner of the playground, I can walk away, or I can get drawn in. So I think having those places where we're not preaching, where we're not extracting, where we're just holding the space and then offering. And I've been thinking about what I would like pre-COVID. We were talking about, could we take some of these meetings into places that, like, can we use the public infrastructure that we have? Like, could we hold community meetings on the 47 bus? Like, it goes to communities I'm not part of. So let's use the infrastructure. Let's use the library. Let's use the park bench. Like, let's be visible. There's a academic around democracy who says we have to use these things or they go. And so how do we like the bus? I would love to do the bus. Like, I just think it would be really fun. But again, you're not forcing people into that. You can have your conversation on the bus and people come around. But I think it's hard, and I think you have to go in and be ready to hear things you don't agree with. Like, that's the hardest one I've ever done. Was my first session. It was with a group of unionists in Launceston. I kind of had to walk through this club past the pokies, and in my head I was like, oh yeah, unionists, they'll all be jolly playing tubas like in the British movies. And then they were not. They were throwing spitballs across the room, kind of thing. They were these sort of blokes in their 20s. And the first thing they said to me was, refugees, they get $300,000 a year. My granddad's a veteran. He gets nothing. We should send them home. And I had to, in that moment, be like, I'm here to listen. Put it on your sticky note. Put it on the wall. We're not going to have a big hoo-ha. And I later had an amazing conversation with those guys. But I had to let go of my own, I had to be willing to be momentarily converted, and that's hard and it feels wrong. And yeah, that's not very helpful, but yeah.
No, on the contrary, I think it's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Millie.
Yeah, very helpful and very real. I'm very sorry to say that I have to wrap up if we're going to keep the time. That's been a really stimulating conversation, and I would just love to keep going for hours. I guess we can all go and read everything on the Australia Remade website, and perhaps there's a portal to keep the conversation going with you there, Millie.
Yeah, I've been enjoying the mailing list, and just send me an email. Like, there's a lot on the website, but there's a lot that happens behind the scenes as well. So just sing out.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Millie.
Thank you very much, Millie, and go and enjoy Nina.
Okay, bye, Millie. Okay, so I'm looking for my notes on what is coming up next. We have a half-hour break now before the next session at 11. So Peter's going to end the recording, and we're welcome to stay on the line during our break and chat, or go away and get a cup of tea and come back at 11. At 11 o'clock, there'll be a panel and audience conversation about relating to our MPs with Glenn Cummings from ProAct, Rob Salter from Active Democracy Australia, and Craig Blackley from Vote Easy.
And I'll also just introduce Anna Bateman, who's just joined us from the local party Tasmania, who will also be participating in that panel. And I just had a little flurry interchange with Nadine Alma, whose name you might have seen pop up. She's part of the Canberra Uni Deliberative Democracy Centre, who've been doing the Connecting to Parliament work, which was Nick Valos's presentation in the in the preview session. So I think we will welcome all those people back in to the conversation at 11. So I think it's worth, we've all been sitting here for an hour and a half. It's probably worth for our well-being to stand up and go for a walk or come back at 11, but stay connected. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.